Hello and welcome to this podcast for cell biology. In this podcast, we're going to focus on these pigments that are found within the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplasts. In talking about these pigments, we're going to talk about the role that the sunlight has in absorbing different wavelengths and exciting these pigment molecules to produce the necessary energy for the light reactions. So before we talk about the pigments, let's talk about the nature of light. So we'll draw our friend here, the sun, and we'll see that the sun emits what we call light, but it's more appropriate to call it electromagnetic radiation. But this is what we often just refer to as the sunlight. Now, electromagnetic radiation is characterized by the wavelength. And one wavelength is the distance from the peak of one wave to the next. So this is a wavelength. Now the electromagnetic radiation around us can exist in many different wavelengths, and they are characterized on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, we will see the smallest wavelengths, and those are called gamma. And so you might think of these wavelengths as being something very tight like this. At the other end of the spectrum, you would see radio waves. And these have much larger wavelengths. Somewhere in the middle, not the exact middle, is this range of wavelengths that we call visible light. At one end of this visible light spectrum, we have high energy visible light. And at the other end of this spectrum of visible light, we have low energy visible light waves. These are the waves that we can see. These are the electromagnetic radiation that our eyes can visualize. A term that I want to introduce to you right now is called photon. And what a photon is, it's a single particle of light. When we think of sunlight hitting the earth, we can think of there being many particles of light within each of these waves. Each one of these single particles is a photon. And as we move on, it is a photon that will excite a chlorophyll molecule in the light reactions. So remember this word, photon. Okay, so let's spend a little bit more time talking about this visible light and how objects on Earth either reflect or absorb these visible lights. So we'll draw our sun here again. And as it comes to Earth here, remember that it contains all wavelengths of visible light. It also has some wavelengths of non-visible light, but we're going to focus on the visible light. When these photons hit an object, the wavelengths will either absorb or reflect each of these visible lights. If we see an object and it's red, we would assume it's absorbing visible light in the green spectrum and the blue spectrum, but it's reflecting visible light in the red spectrum. And that is why it's red. Now if we think about our chloroplast here and these thylakoid membranes here, which contain the pigments, remember it is the photons from the sun that will interact with these pigments. There are many kinds of pigments that we will find within the thylakoid, but we want to talk about two. The first include chlorophylls. These can either be A or B chlorophyll. They absorb light that is in the red and blue spectrum, and they reflect green light, which is why when you see most plants, they have a green appearance to them. It's because of the pigment chlorophyll. The next pigment is called carotenoids. There are several kinds, but the two that your book talks about are the carotenoids, which is why carrots are orange, and the other one is xanthophylls. And this is why corn appears yellow. We'll talk a little bit more about carotenoids, but you should also know this is why we see red and yellow and orange colors in the fall. So carotenoids, in general, will absorb blue and green light, but they will reflect color wavelengths in that red spectrum, which will include the yellows and the oranges and such. So I'd like to show the structures here of chlorophylls A and B. as well as one of our carotenoids of beta-carotene. Now, you're not going to have to draw these, but I would like you to be able to recognize the difference between these two on a quiz or an exam. Some of the noticeable differences, as you can see, is this beta-carotene has these two reactive centers on either end of it, followed in between by this hydrocarbon chain. The chlorophylls, A and B, have this large reactive center on one end of the molecule, and then this large hydrocarbon chain extending from it. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the structure of chlorophyll, and so I'm going to just show you a picture of chlorophyll and then write some things about it. Alright, so here's chlorophyll. You should know that the difference between A and B chlorophyll is that A has a methyl group here, and chlorophyll B has this CHO link here. But more importantly, let's talk about the overall structure. First, remember that chlorophyll A and B are both pigments in the thylakoid membrane. As I said on the last slide, it absorbs red and blue light, and it reflects green light. Now, as you can see, this is a fairly unique structure, so I want to talk separately about this end, which is called the head end, and then follow it up with the tail end. This is the part that absorbs light, absorbs the red and blue light. In this region here of the head, photons excite electrons, and those excited electrons, as we'll talk about later, are important in the electron transfer that we see in the light reactions. These excited electrons are very unstable. Now, excited electrons outside of the cell would generate heat, but inside the cell, as I mentioned before, we're going to harness that into energy. Now I would say something about the tail portion. This tail portion associates with other membrane proteins to anchor chlorophyll to the membrane, more specifically the thylakoid membrane. Okay, now I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the carotenoids and their purpose. We can see that the purpose for the chlorophylls is its function in photosynthesis, but the carotenoids have a slightly different function. The carotenoids serve many functions. Alright, the first is that they can help in photosynthesis. Though the chlorophylls are more efficient at harnessing that energy, some of that light isn't absorbed by all the chlorophylls, and so carotenoids can absorb some of that light, and it can be used in photosynthesis. In fact, this is why we see those fall colors, orange and reds and yellows. Because in the fall, what happens is the chlorophyll molecules start to degrade, but the carotenoid molecules don't, or not as quickly. So come, say, October or so, all the chlorophyll molecules have been degraded, but the carotenoids, pigments, are still around. And that's why we see those pretty colors in the fall. But probably the most important function is that they are protective. If all carotenoids are destroyed, the plant will lose chlorophyll and die. And the way they are protecting it, as best as we can determine, is by absorbing free radicals. All those photons entering this system can generate free radicals, which can damage the DNA, as well as proteins in the cell. So as long as these carotenoids are present, they will absorb these free radicals and protect the plant cells against damage caused by these radicals. Once the carotenoids are gone, that protection is also gone, and the plants will die.